If customers keep asking if you have a certain crop and you don't, should you grow it? It depends. And that's the focus of today's show. When, how, and why to start producing a new microgreen crop with grower Chris Thoreau. Welcome to the Growing Microgreens Podcast. I'm your host, Diego, D-I-E-G-O. This is a show all about how to grow microgreens successfully. In each episode, grower Chris Thoreau will share 10 plus years of microgreen experience giving insights for people who operate or want to operate a profitable microgreens business. As we go through this series, if you want to learn more from Chris, check out his online course using the link in the description below. Today, microgreen farmer Chris Thoreau and I are talking about new crops. Specifically, how and why do you start growing them? On the surface, that may seem like a simple and straightforward question, but there are a lot of specifics involved in answering that question, and the specifics are where profits are made or where money is lost. If you're thinking about starting a farm or adding some new crops to the mix, then this episode is for you. Chris will put the theory to reality and talk about his experiences and failures introducing new crops like basil. He'll go through his methodology and what his thought process was and the why of it all. As you'll hear, not everything always works, regardless of how much experience you have, and sometimes some crops are better off not grown. With that, let's get into it with microgreen farmer Chris Thoreau. Today I want to get into this idea of hypothetical crops. There's a lot of different crops that anybody could grow when it comes to microgreens, and I wanted to get some of your thought process of coming up with how do you decide whether to even try a new crop or not. So let's start at the very kind of top of the funnel. There's a lot of new crops out there. How would you even think about introducing a new crop? Do you need some of your existing customers to ask for it? Or do you kind of go to them and say, I think you'd like this, I think it'd be a fit, and then lead in that way with the crop?
So for us, we often start a new crop because we're all hearing from customers like, hey, do you guys grow arugula, or do you do basil, or do you do broccoli? And I think once you've heard something enough times, and we've all heard it enough times, we start going, okay, well, maybe we should give this a try. Another approach might be you're talking to another grower, or you see a video online or something. It's like, this is what this crop is selling for. This is what this crop is worth, or this is what this crop can yield. So we're kind of always looking for something that might be, there's a market for. And two, there's the price point for.
How do you weigh customer inquiry with realistically potentially buying that product? I know a lot of people, they might say, hey, it'd be nice if you had this, but when it comes time to buy it, they either don't want to buy quantity or don't want to pay the price for it. So how do you weigh the inquiry with, is there actually an economic opportunity there?
Yeah, so we have this conversation. We've had it a number of times over the years, and not just with the crop. We've actually had this conversation about soil. As an example, one of our customers is vegan, and he's a long-time customer, buys a lot of stuff from us, and he's like, can you do vegan soil? And in case anybody's wondering, what a vegan soil is, there's no animal byproducts, so there'd be no animal manure. So if you had a compost base in there, it couldn't be from animal waste, it would have to be from plant waste. So we did talk about that. We thought, okay, if we create this new soil, number one, is it going to perform? Two, what is it going to cost? And three, is there a market out there for it? So is there enough of a market for a vegan, an organic microgreen grown in a vegan soil for us to justify potentially spending more money or having two different types of soil to have two different types of product? And in that case, we were just, we did a little bit of research. We talked to our soil supplier and talked about different things. I think we even tried a few different soils, and pretty quickly we were like, we're already putting a lot of work into this. We've only heard it from one customer, and maybe we've heard it 3 or 4 times within a month or two span from that customer. So we're a little imbalanced about the real demand for that. And in that case, it's we decided not to go forward with it. Same thing does happen with other crops. Customers might say, "Can you grow amaranth for us?" or "Can you grow basil for us?" or something. And often, because over the years I've looked into a lot of crops, and often it's just like, "No, we can't do that. It doesn't fit into our system. It's a cool weather crop, or it doesn't yield well enough, or we've tried it before and it just didn't sell." So those are a few things that have happened many times. And the other thing for us is it takes time and energy to research a new crop. We have a very specific system in which very specific crops do well. And like, in short, we're kind of lazy. Like, we don't want a whole bunch more development. We don't feel like doing that stuff. We've got our system that works. We've got our crops that work. We've got a fairly steady demand, or enough of a demand for those crops. And so for us, tweaking the system, because it is such a small system and isn't really, it's not easy to sort of segment it into different zones or something for different types of crops. I think we've just been like, unless we see a real advantage with a crop, or we see something really could sell, then it's just, we're going to stick with what we know and hope the market stays there.
So say there's a crop that you've had a bunch of people asking for. Is the first step, okay, let me look at the actual plant and determine whether it's going to be a fit in our growing system? And then if it passed that filter where it would work in your system, would the next step be look at how do you actually grow it at a microgreen level?
First thing we do if someone asks about a crop actually is if we know it's not something we're familiar with, or we need more information, is we Google it right away. So there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of basic information. And that probably the number one question for us is, how long is the growing cycle? Because of our system has a quick turnaround, that's a factor for us. So is it everything we have right now is on an 8-day cycle. So if it's something like basil, which is a 20 to 25-day cycle, we intuitively don't think that's going to work. We've tried it and it didn't work. We would probably never entertain a crop that takes more than, say, 10 days. It just wouldn't be, it would take up too much real estate in our very dense system. And then the other thing is what is that crop going to yield per tray? And then what do we need to charge for that crop in order to make that tray worth, $12, $15, $20, whatever we think that tray needs to be worth to make it economically viable. And one of the things we're trying not to do is have this really high value product in really small volumes, like a lot of microgreens are. We do want to push microgreens as like a bulk salad, something you eat a lot of. And so we can push production out in a bigger volume, kind of taking away a bit of the elitism of it. And so that's just a specific value we have. And we have made exceptions to that based on, one, feedback from customers about products they want. And then two, the other thing is, your customers asking for a crop is one thing, actually buying it is another. And we have this with buckwheat all the time. We grow buckwheat for a part of the year, and we stop growing it because the hulls are a pain, and it grows so fast it's hard to control. And then we stop growing it, and people are like, "Oh, how come you don't have buckwheat anymore?" And when's buckwheat coming back? And then you grow it and you take a bunch to market and nobody buys it. So sometimes you've got to go through the process to realize what's going to work and what isn't. The counter example to that is arugula. We get requests for arugula. One of my co-op partners, Ross, he's like, we should give it a shot. I'll start doing some test trays. And we just did them and handed out a few samples, started taking them to market. And, last market, Jamie came back. She's like, yeah, I sold 30 clamshells of arugula. So it's sometimes you've just got to put a product out there and hope for the best. Sometimes it takes some time to build that up, but those are things we're thinking about. So yeah, what's the crop cycle? Can we grow it in our system? What's the value of it? And then once we do it, we're monitoring it to see, okay, we're growing it. Are people buying it? Is it cost effective? Also, how long does it take to harvest? Our peas and radish are super fast. We've got a fairly efficient system with the sunflower, even though it's not as fast. And our arugula is a lot slower, but we sell enough of it to make it worth it. So if it was something like, oh, okay, it takes twice as long to harvest as arugula and we sell a little bit less, we might start going, we're not sure that this is worth it. Of course, we then want to balance that off with, okay, well, it's not a big money maker, but it's giving us a bit more diversity at the market. And that's actually bringing more people, because the people who are buying our other stuff might add this as an additional purchase because it's something unique and new, or it's something that only we have. So those are some of the things we've experienced years in terms of how we deal with introducing and maintaining new crops.
And just for context, how many total trays of all product are you producing a week right now?
That's a good question because I'm not working as much these days. But at the beginning of this year, we had very high volume, and we would have been doing 300 trays a week, I think.
Given that you are producing, say, 300 trays a week, for a new crop, let's say arugula, it passed those initial metrics. It's going to work in your system. Harvest time looks okay. Harvest efficiency seems like it's going to be a fit. You can charge enough for it. Once it passed those metrics, let's call them theoretical metrics on paper, how would you then go about testing it in reality in your system? Because if you're doing 300 trays, you're not going to roll out with 20 trays of this right off the bat. So how would you start introducing it to the system to, one, learn how it grows in your system, and then two, slowly scale it up to whatever ultimately would be full production?
Yeah, so I think usually we start off, there's often, some very scientific approaches to things, and there's often some very let's just do it this way approaches. So when we trial something new, we often do it with 3 trays. And we do it with 3 trays because we stack our trays in 3s. So we could just add another stack to our germination shelving. The other reason to do 3 trays is when we uncover the crop, when it's ready to be put in the light, we take those 3 trays and we put them at different places in the greenhouse. So because we have 3 tiers of shelving, vertical shelving, the growing on the bottom shelf is actually different than it is on the top shelf. And one end of the greenhouse is a little warmer than the other end of the greenhouse. And so we shift the trays around and we kind of look like, okay, so how is the crop growing overall? And is it growing better in one type of location? Because we already know with the crops we have where the best place to put them in the greenhouse is. And so we want to try to figure out as many different things as we can at a time, so we're not taking too long to do trials. So yeah, we'll start off with maybe 3 trays, and then so those don't go to waste, we'll start cutting and we'll take samples to market or to restaurants when we're doing deliveries. Because we've been delivering to some restaurants for many years. We'll come in and say, hey, we're trying arugula. Here you go, give it a try. If you want some, we'll continue producing it. And then what'll inevitably happen as we do that for restaurants, we might have a few trays left over. And what often happens is we're doing 3 trays. The yield on those trays gets better and better with each cycle because we're learning how to grow the crop better. So what 3 trays, week 1 might give you 3 clamshells, and then in week it's giving you, 12 clamshells. So, the way it did work with arugula with us is we did send it out to a few restaurants. A few of them took it on, so we always knew we had to produce what they needed. And then whenever we produce something, we produce a buffer. If we know we need 3 trays worth, we need to sow more than 3 trays in case something goes wrong. And some of those trays are allocated to restaurants, and some of it's going to be extra. And so we put that to the farmer's market. So that's our second sort of testing ground is this product moving at the farmer's market? And so when we did that with arugula, we took 5 clamshells to the market. Okay, 5 clamshells sold. Okay, good. Well, let's sow the 3 trays for our restaurants and enough to get 5 clamshells for the market and our buffer. And once again, the buffer ends up being extra that goes to the market. And so with basil, we just started taking, or with arugula, we started taking more and more clamshells to market, and they kept selling. So we got to a point where instead of having 5 trays a week, we're doing, 15 or 20 trays a week of arugula. And the next thing we know, we've got a new product. Like, it's not something we're trying out. It's like, oh yeah, we do arugula now. And We started arugula late last year. It's really become a part of our system this year. And now we're actually having the question, do we add this to our grocer lineup, which is a sort of that third, customer base that we have. So that's how the process went with arugula. And we often use the market as the place to test things out, because you can take stuff, you can sample it a lot. You're seeing a lot of your regular customers. So there's a lot of good opportunity to introduce something new. What we need to be mindful of with the arugula is knowing what the seasonality of crops is, because in the spring, it's going to be one of the first crops farmers have at the market. And so when spring comes, I anticipate our arugula sales going down because people will start buying arugula, by the leaf. So we'll see. We'll see if that holds out.
With those 3 initial trays, do you see those all at the same density? And is that density just based upon kind of your gut feel from how things have grown in the past? And if they're the same density, at what point do you start playing around with the density on the trays to try and optimize that?
Yeah, so in terms of determining density in the first place, you go to Dr. Google and you take a look and you see what other people are doing. Are you doing a tablespoon? Are you doing a teaspoon? How much are you doing? It depends on the crop, And then with that, you're kind of going, well, what have I done with other crops that are similar to this? So when we think of arugula, we've done kale sprouts before, and it's the exact same seed. So I'm thinking, well, what was our planting density then, or what is it relative to radish, which is a similar seed? So that's part of it. In terms of varying densities, often with those 3 trays, one will be like 3/4 of a teaspoon, and then a teaspoon and a quarter. And that way we can get a sense of where that's at. I often kind of, maybe it's my ego, I'm like, I think this is the density. It's this teaspoon plus a little bit on top, and then we'll start with a density like that. Because, as we've discussed before, you want to sort of maximize density to get the most yield you can out of every tray. The risk is, as your density goes up, your disease can go up. So what we're trying to do is make it as dense as we can, and we start that way in the beginning, and then we watch for disease. And with arugula, it's something we did experience. We had some really beautiful dense trays, but they were inconsistent because they'd get these little patches of mold and they would die off. And in the arugula, it would spread a little bit. Whereas in sunflower or pea, if we get a little bit of disease, it doesn't spread, it just stays there, and that spot doesn't grow. So we did play around. Once we had a good sense of about what the yield is, we did play around a little bit with the sowing density afterwards. So it's definitely a combination of trial, of a bit of research, and then just a little bit of intuition as well. I know the way our arugula looks, it's actually planted a little less dense than I would like it. I can see a little bit of space between the leaves, which to me is just wasted space. But we're also seeing that, there's less disease that way. So it's almost a bit of a compromise in that way.
How would you weigh these two? How well it's selling to your customers and how well it's performing in your system? Those are the 2 factors I see here that are going to take something from the testing stage to the more serious stage of, okay, we're scaling this up. This looks like this is going to be a product. Which, do you want to see both those equally?
Well, this kind of makes me think of basil. We had some people who were quite interested in basil. They'd ask about it a lot. But we would have, mold that came in and wipe out half a tray of basil. And as soon as that happens, that tray is worth, $3. You're cutting around, you're getting little snippets there. So the time it takes, and then the risk of cutting and then getting some moldy sprouts in there is high. So we tried real hard with basil because we felt there was a demand there. People were asking for it at the market. Some of the restaurants were really into it. But number one, it was getting a lot of disease and on a regular basis. And often what happens with a new crop we introduce is it can get, actually this happens with either a new crop or new seed with the crop we're already growing, is in the beginning, it does get a little bit more disease. And then as we grow it more, that disease tends to go away. And, you might say, well, our growing methods have improved in that time period, maybe airflow and watering, and that's what made the disease go away. And in some cases, that's true, or in some cases, that's a factor. But the other thing is, when you're introducing new seed to the system, you're actually introducing more than just the seed. You're introducing the microbial life that exists on the seed. And when you bring something in, even if you're sanitizing that seed, it's going to be a little bit of a disruptor in your greenhouse or whatever system you're growing in. And so it might be able to take over a lot quicker because there's nothing that specifically competes with it, or the microbe that can compete with it isn't in high enough numbers in order to do so. And so after weeks of this new seed being in the greenhouse, the other, microbial life in the greenhouse does start to respond to that. And thus, as they get into balance, that disease actually lowers. So it's completely a theory, but I've seen it happen enough times that, it's not like, if I've got a crop in the ground and things change over the weeks, like the weather changes, my watering changes, all this other stuff changes. And so you can see what you're doing and how it has an effect. This is a crop that's there for 8 days, or even less in some cases. So it's always a new crop. And so when disease goes away and you're only making minor changes, you've got to think about what are the things in the system that are changing. And one of the things that is changing is that balance of microbial life that exists. I have no idea what the question is that you asked me now, because I think that was actually a tangent.
That got into it. It was really looking at when you're introducing a new crop and you're trying to scale this up, the initial phase is testing. And you're looking at two things. You're looking at how much is my market actually absorbing the product that I'm producing? Because if they're taking it away quickly, that's a good sign. If you can grow it, you have someplace to sell it. So you want to see that. On the other hand, like the basil example, you want to know that you can consistently grow it. So you're trying to weigh these two. It has to sell and you have to be able to grow it. Is there one that you'd rather see? Do you feel like if you can grow it, you can eventually find someplace to sell it? But it doesn't sound like, knowing basil, that just because people want it doesn't mean you're going to be able to grow it.
Yeah, and then the other thing is, even if you can grow it, it doesn't mean that people are going to buy it. So that might be the case with, say, buckwheat, which is it's a acquired taste. Some people really like it, and a lot of people, they just don't get it, and so it's inconsistent. The other thing is something might be too niche. They might be too specialized, and in one case in point would be corn shoots, which take a little bit of trouble to grow. People who like them really, really love them, but it's a very, very small portion of the market who will take them, and a lot of effort goes into that because it has very specific needs. The third thing to consider with a crop that we touched on earlier, what is how much real estate does it take up, and for how long? So as I said before, all of our crops right now are on an 8-day cycle, and then you've got basil on a 20 or 25-day cycle. So if you think about, you're doing 5 trays per harvest, and you're doing 2 harvests per week, and you've got a 3-week cycle, I've got 10, 20, 30 trays of basil going at any given time in order to harvest 5 every week. Whereas with a cycle that I'm doing on an 8-day cycle, there's just 2 crops going at a time, as opposed to 2, 4, 6. So that basil has to sell really well in order to make its basically pay its rent. And if we were to do that calculation per time spent, basil would be more expensive by 3 times, because the cycle's 3 times. Plus, it's a smaller crop, which yields less, so we actually bump the price up. So we'd have to be charging about 6 times the price for basil that we charge for anything else for it to really be a moneymaker. And that's just not. There's no market for that, and it's not the market we want. It's too narrow a market.
So this kind of goes back to something I think you said in a previous episode: is you go in with a lot of assumptions. You grow based on those assumptions, and then you really just see how true they are. At some point, you just have to make some guesses and then test it out. And I'm assuming there's really no way to get hurt here, at least big time. When you test out something, you're not buying any sort of huge seed order initially. So really your only cost is you're losing some real estate in the greenhouse, and you're maybe wasting some soil. but it's hard to kind of blow up, financially testing out some of these things, I would think.
It's true. The only place I think you can get burned is if you think you're doing well with the crop, you've got a lot of restaurant orders or you've got a lot of demand at the market, and then the crop starts failing. Like we thought we had basil down and we had a couple of good weeks and we thought, okay, we're through that disease period. And then it went back to this, disease phase again. So yeah, you're right in general. There's very little risk, and we do this with a lot of crops. We buy a small amount of seed, we test it out. And then if we know it's good, we buy a bit more, a larger quantity, we test it out. And then, yeah, after a while, it's like, okay, yeah, we're good to go. We're gonna keep going with this. Where it can get tricky is if you don't test your assumptions occasionally. And so what I've really enjoyed in the past couple of years, having some new co-op members on, is I have a lot of assumptions, and I check them once in a while. But once again, like the ego kind of gets in the way, and it's like, no, this is the way you do this, and this is the way you do that, because that's what's always worked, and that's what we're going to keep doing. Like if it's not broke, we're not going to fix it. And then somebody brings another idea and you change things up and you go, oh, well, it wasn't broke, but it wasn't optimized. So that's one thing that happens. And then the other thing is a crop does start not doing very well. And you're like, well, what's going on here? What are we doing that's different? And what do we need to change? And the trick there is that you can get a new lot of seed that actually performs different than the last lot of seed. And so we get this with sunflower all the time, and I've talked about this many times, and I talk about it in the workshop. We trial every batch of sunflower fairly extensively before we buy a large quantity, because every crop of sunflower is very different. The size of the seed is different. The uniformity of the crop is different. The soak time for germination is different. It's really tricky. And so the original assumption with sunflower was you need to soak it overnight for good germination, and then you sow it the next day. And we had a batch of seed that just didn't do well. And then we thought, well, let's just try soaking it for a couple of hours and see what happens. And that made it a lot better. So we had to change that assumption. That assumption applied to that lot of seed. But then we had to switch our assumption with the next lot of seed. Similar thing used to happen with pea. Like could grow pea, everything was fine, and then it started shifting. And I think it happened with the new batch of seed. And so what we used to do is when we uncovered the seed from the pea from the germination stage, we would have it spend another day in the dark by putting like a tray on top of it upside down, so to create a dark dome over top. And that just keeps it in the dark, keeps it blanched, so it's not turning green, and it causes it to stretch a little bit. And in my mind, that's what you had to do in order to get the crop. And it just wasn't working anymore. So one week I just said, like, let's just skip that stage and see what happens. And boom, like everything started growing well again. So once again, there was a specific lot of seed or several lots of seed that, did better in those conditions, but subsequent and previous lots wanted something different. So going back to like one of your earlier questions, I'm always drawing on what experiences I've had with other crops to think about, okay, what's an assumption here? What's a principle I need to think about here? What are the factors to take into consideration? And I'm always looking at temperature, water, and airflow, and then soaking time. And so it is good to keep those things always in mind if something goes wrong, because the idea is you want to correct that as quickly as possible. We have gone through long phases of not being able to get the yields that we're typically used to getting. And I remember we went from sowing 40 trays of sunflower for a harvest to 70 trays of sunflower per harvest, because that's how many we needed to get the volume that we were selling. And it was the same volume. It's just we couldn't get the yield until we just figured out what the problems were. So there can be a cost in that way for sure. If you're not growing things optimally, a tray may only cost 88 cents in soil, and it may only cost, $1 in seed, but it takes labor to harvest that tray. So if we're harvesting 70 trays instead of 40, that actually almost doubles the labor cost in harvesting that same amount of product.
And thinking of that and knowing that you don't want to waste a lot of time in the future in this testing stage, would you get seed from a few different suppliers, or is seed just so variable regardless of whether you get it from a few different suppliers or you get multiple batches from the same supplier, you're always going to have that variability? What I'm trying to figure out is, like, initially you're going to get a test batch of seed of some quantity, but if you scale it up to production, you're going to order a much larger quantity. And what would you need to see to then make the investment in the larger quantity of seed, knowing that that larger quantity is going to work for what you need it to do in your system, so you're not stuck with all this seed that's just producing poor results?
So first thing, we're about to go through this with sunflower. We found a lot of sunflower seed we really liked, and we bought a lot of it, more than we could afford. So we bought a big batch of it, and then I asked the seed company we buy from, who we've been buying from for many years, so I have a good relationship. Can you hold a pallet of this for me? Like, we can't store it, we can't pay you for it, but we've been a customer for years, so like come April, we're going to order this, and we'll take it in then. Because the seed was so good. It just, it was Canadian seed. It germinated really well. It was super uniform, never had any disease problems. It greened up really quickly. And so we knew we had a lot we liked. So the first thing I do when I'm ordering seed is I ask the company, and right now we just deal with one company, so I'll answer the other part of your question in a bit, tell me about this. We'll use sunflower as an example. Tell me about the sunflower seed you've got in. So first thing I actually want to know is where it's from. Over the years, we've kind of learned like the seed from Italy and from Canada and from the US have fairly unique characteristics. And so that gives us a sense of what to expect right away. And then the second question is, how much of that seed have you got? Because if you've only got like 200 kilograms left and you're going to send me a 10 kilogram bag and I'm going to spend a couple of weeks trialing it, by the time I'm ready to buy that, the rest of that seed's actually sold. So there's no point trialing a variety if you actually can't buy more. So the reason I'm always checking in with the seed company on that is to know, like, okay, we've got 200 kilograms of seed in stock, so that's probably going to give us about 20 weeks worth of production. By then, the company's probably going to be on another lot of seed. So let's see what the lot now is, because if this is a really good lot, we want to buy this now, because when we go to test later and they're at the end of that lot, it won't be available. And so what we can do is we can test that lot. If it's good, we're like, okay, this is what we want. We're going to buy this much. And if you can hold on to this much for us, please do. And I think there's very little risk in them holding on to it, because if we were to call up and say, hey, we've gone out of business or this has happened, they can still sell that seed. It's not like it's set aside and contaminated because we're holding on to it. So the other thing is, if we don't like that seed, we can kind of go, well, okay, if we need to, we can buy little bits of this to get us going if there's a gap, but we're going to wait for that next batch of seed to come in to see how that does. Now you get two bad batches in a row, and in short, you're screwed. And we've definitely had it where we've had a bad batch. The seed isn't, it's just not optimized. It's good, but maybe it's not very uniform, or it ends up being just a little bit yellow at harvest time still. You find ways to make it better, but you can't make a good crop from bad seed. You really can't. So yeah, number one is making sure there's enough of that seed. And when you do find seed, you buy lots of it. Now on another, with another hat that I wear, like I'm actually conducting with a group from the University of British Columbia and farmers here in BC, a bunch of vegetable variety trials. And for that, we actually buy seed from different companies, because this seed is grown in specific microclimates in different parts of North America. And so even each of those varieties is going to have unique characteristics, and we want to see how those characteristics perform here. So it's really, really important to get it from all over the place from these different seed companies. The trick with microgreen seed is there's not a lot of people that specialize in it. And we've talked about this before when we've talked about sanitation and hygiene. We're buying our seed from a sprout supplier who tests their seed for pathogens when it comes in. And so we know it's already gone through that first phase of being screened as a good quality seed for sprouting. The other thing is we buy primarily from a company that does sell to commercial growers at a larger scale. And so the price point makes sense. If I start buying from a lot of other companies, a lot of places don't do specialized microgreen seed. So the price is actually quite a bit higher, even at volumes we buy. So that's been a challenge. And we've kind of been burned where we just need a little bit of seed to get us by, and we're paying 5 times the amount for that seed from these other suppliers. But it's probably not a bad idea to shop around. that's going to be more of an option in the United States than it is going to be in Canada. We just have, we have a smaller population, and it's very, very difficult to do that. The other thing is with microgreens crops, like they're grown on large scales, unlike vegetables, which are often grown in smaller lots in a lot of different locations. So they're usually part of bigger lots, and there's a good possibility that a lot of the seed companies I buy from for microgreens could actually be carrying the same lot of seed. So it is hard to know, and that's actually the case with vegetable seed as well. So yeah, shopping around isn't a bad idea, because you're not only looking for seed quality, you're looking for service, you're looking for price. It's going to depend on how close that seed is to you. I've had to ship in seed from Florida before, and that's an expensive shipping charge for us. Whereas if we're just bringing it in from the prairies here, or even from Washington State, it's much closer, so the shipping cost is much reduced.
So really, in your situation, I mean, part of the initial consideration has to be, can I actually procure enough seed to scale this up?
Yeah, like I have to say, like we're buffered against a number of things with our business model. But if our seed supplier, like the one that we use primarily, was to go out of business, we would probably go out of business. For us to find something else at that price point and the consistent quality and a fairly consistent level of service that's Canadian based, like ideally we want to be buying from a Canadian supplier, then that's a major factor. The other thing is actually soil. We're in Vancouver, we're in a metropolitan area. We've got tons of options for soil. For a lot of folks, getting a manufactured soil to your, to your site could be very, very expensive. If we buy, $2,000 worth of soil, it's $300 or $400 to get it to us. You might double that price if that truck has to drive a couple hours to get to you. So soil is another thing that can be hard to source. And then once you've sourced it, actually, finding the right quality of soil that's going to work for you.
When it comes to seed and looking at new crops, are there some seeds when it comes to microgreens that the seed itself is prohibitively expensive based upon what you can pass off to the customer in terms of cost?
There are cases where the seed is noticeably more expensive. And so a great example that we've had recently is with a red daikon. So when we do a radish, we do a 2 or 3 radish mix, and we used to have this red daikon that we put into it. And the price on that was 2.5 times what we would pay for other seed. So it was a significant difference, but the red really made the mix look really, really good. And so we paid a bit more. It still made it worth it. And because we were using less of the red seed, it would go a lot further. Now, one of our last lots of seed, and this is a great example of checking in with the seed company. So they said, well, we've got this lot in, but it's a red radish, but it's about 25% green. So it's actually only about 75% red. So I said, okay, well, we'll give it a little try. We'll see what it's like. And we did it, and we grew it out, and we could see the difference, and actually found by the time it had reached maturity, it looked more like it was sort of like 50% red. And what would happen if you grew it just a little bit longer, that red would start to turn green. And so for us, if we're going to spend extra money on seed, it has to be giving you something different. And if it's a red seed that actually isn't red or turns green by harvest time, that really wasn't worth it for us. We loved the red in the mix, but the seed price was just making it not worth it, even at a reduced price. So what we'll do now, every time I call, it's like, so what do you have for red daikon? Is it a new batch? And so once that seed gets back to a good point where it's say 80-90% red, because interestingly with daikon, like apparently they've had a lot of trouble breeding green out of it. Just no matter what they do, there's always some green in it. And so we'll check in, and if there's a good batch of red and it's going to yield well, then we will pay that price again, because we do think it makes the product look a little better and probably helps sales in that way as well. People notice. It's like, we see the red daikon is back, or hey, we see that, we're noticing the red stems in the sunflower again, or the peas they're really leafing out, or they're super tender now. So people do notice that stuff. So by responding to that, you do get a good feedback from your customers.
Thinking of some of the longer crops that might take longer to harvest, like basil, say you could have gotten that to work and you didn't have the mold issues, knowing that it's going to take up more real estate on a time basis. So it's going to take, let's say, 24 days when all your other crops are harvested at like 8 days. It's in there 3 times as long. In that case, would you have to justify charging 3 times as much to pay for that real estate?
Yeah, I think so. Because once again, the other factor is how long and difficult it takes to harvest. And what would be grown in that space otherwise. So if I could grow 3 times as many pea or sunflower, which I'm already growing a lot of, so adding, if I'm growing 40 trays and I want to add 10 more trays to that harvest, it's not going to take 30% longer because the setup is the same and the cleanup is the same. So doing more of one crop is actually more efficient. If the demand was really there, then we might do that. But I guess we just never really experienced that. The other thing is, there's kind of this, it's once again our kind of laziness. Like when you can harvest a pea tray in 17 seconds, and it takes you 3.5 minutes to harvest a tray of basil, you just feel like you're just standing there doing nothing, right? So it's a matter of just like, I don't like harvesting the basil. I don't like how long this takes. And we've had that. We get that with, like I said, we got that with buckwheat. Like people just didn't like harvesting it. And we were like, there may be some demand for it, but we don't want to grow it. So we just let people know we're not.
Knowing this idea of laziness, I mean, at some point here, I'm thinking laziness can be good because, in many ways, I think human nature is to do more, to grow more, to just push the limits. And sometimes I think the better thing, the wiser thing is to go the route of what you guys have done in a way. And that's kind of accepting that laziness, find what works well in your system, stick to it. And then why shake the box if what you have is working and you're selling it and the system's optimized for it? It sounds like it's just a lot of work, a lot of potential hassle to introduce these other crops, which at the end of the day aren't going to make up a large slice of the pie in your total business.
Well, I do use laziness, or what I might say more accurately, I use boredom as an indicator. Like when you're bored, something's going on. That's information. And often it's very important information. And boredom means like this isn't exciting or this is not interesting. It means something's going on and you should pay attention. So I do notice that. Like when I'm just like, this is so boring. This is taking way too long. This is just like, like I just know something's not right. But the other thing is, and I don't know my economic theory or my psychological theory on this, but Toyota doesn't go, the Corolla's selling well. Let's just keep the Corolla as it is. There's something about that newness, that freshness that's required to keep people interested. And we certainly have a steady stream of customers. Like we want our sunflower shoots and we want this for our smoothies, and that's who we are. But we get other people that come and go. They're like, yeah, great, sunflower shoots again. Like, let's try something new. So I think that freshness, it brings you a new market. It adds more diversity to everything. And it's the same thing in the farming world. The crops that make a lot of money and the ones that don't make a lot of money, but you grow them all because that's sort of part of the package. So we're trying to find a balance, I think, with that. And like grow the stuff we know works, but things shift. Like it used to be that sunflower was our main crop. And now we're probably selling as much pea and radish as sunflower. So markets change. A lot of things can change. So if you don't have sort of buffers or things that you can move on to, you might get stuck one day going, there's actually no demand for sunflower shoots and pea shoots anymore. So, and we can't make enough money growing radish and wheatgrass. So that's it. We didn't diversify or adapt quick enough. And so if someone else comes on the market and they're doing a bit of sunflower and a bit of pea, but they're doing a kale mustard mix, and they're doing arugula, and they're doing this beautiful amaranth, and they're also delivering by bike and, whatever, then it's going to be, like maybe things have evolved and, we haven't adapted to that. We're not paying attention to what farmers markets want and what our chefs want. So there's always a risk on somebody coming in and just improving on what you're doing and making you, putting you out of business, making you redundant.
Knowing that to help make yourself more resilient in the face of that, do you kind of have some crops in your back pocket that would work well in your system, but there's just not enough demand for them right now? So if that case ever did come up, for some reason everybody hates sunflower now, and you need to start switching on some new crops, there's some that you could go to knowing that they would work in your system, and then it becomes a matter of you just having to market those and sell those.
That's a really good question. In our case, I would say no, but I think in most cases the answer would be yes. So we have a very hot system, a very fast system. But a lot of the microgreens, if you look at some of and I know you've got a ton of big microgreens producers in California, if you look at their catalog, they've just got this selection of brassicas, right? And so it's like broccolis and kales and mustards and arugula and all these different, oriental greens, which are all very closely related. And so they've got this huge selection of those things that are quite variable in color and flavor, probably even a nutrient profile. So if the red mustard and kale mix isn't selling very well, they can go to the Shungiku Mizuna mix instead. They're all very, very similar crops. And so there's a wider range to choose from. One of the limitations of our system, again, is it's really focused on those sort of large seeded crops that are kind of hardy, that grow fast, that can do well in hot conditions. So I think if there was other stuff out there, or there may be, but I haven't discovered it or looked for it, I would probably want to know that I can sort of like, oh, let's just start doing corn, or let's start doing this. There's other crops I know we can grow, but I don't feel they're crops in my back pocket. They don't feel like the foundation or standard. They still feel too niche.
So if you had to look ahead, into the future here, a year from now, do you think you're basically growing what you're growing today?
In a year, yes. But in 5 years, 10 years, it's hard to know because, as you know, things go through phases, and this isn't the first sprout/microgreens phase that's existed in North America. I've seen we've gone in and out of at least one wheatgrass phase since I've been growing it. And the number of people I've talked to over the years that said, I used to live in San Francisco in the 70s and we had a wheatgrass business then. And we used to grow sprouts at home and we had jars in all the different rooms. Like, this is stuff that does go in cycles. So there's a good chance, in 5 years, like nobody gives a shit about microgreens, right? The cool thing is going to be, potatoes and, pumpkins. It's just that's really unpredictable. So if you're experimenting with new things, you can try to keep things fresh and try to adapt to the market. But sometimes the market can just tank.
And I guess, kind of to sum this all up, the big advantage of microgreens over in-ground soil-based veg is, you have adaptability in terms of time. You can try new stuff pretty quickly. You can scale up pretty quickly versus somebody who's an in-the-ground grower. You're going to get one crop of tomatoes a year where you could cycle massive amounts of microgreen trials to find something that works.
Yeah, it's true. Well, the other thing is that, you're getting a chance to grow that crop multiple times. We get to grow sunflower 100 times a year. You get to grow potatoes once, and then you've got to wait till the following year to do it. And no matter how good your notes are, you're going to miss some things. Where if I'm growing sunflower after sunflower after sunflower, that's all going to be very much there. You can become an expert very quickly. And I tell people that, just like, hey, this is all really hard, but if you pay attention and watch your crops, like, within 2 months, you're gonna have grown this crop 30 times already, right? So people do, because you're exposed to it so much, you can learn very, very quickly, and you can play around a lot and get results very quickly.
A crop that didn't work for you is basil. Like, how long did you spend tinkering around with that to try and get it to work before you finally said, we're not growing basil?
Way too long. Like, we just kept going, and probably a good year. And that would be, sometimes we wouldn't do it for a couple of weeks and we'd try again. Sometimes it was 3 trays, sometimes it was 10 trays. And we just never nailed it. And, it could have been our growing, it could have been the seed. I think we actually know we brought in 3 different types of basil from 3 different companies. So going back to the question you asked, yeah, we did do that with basil. We brought in from our regular supplier. I got some from a local supplier here, and I got some from High Mowing Seeds in Vermont, and tried different types of basil, thinking, okay, well, let's try a mammoth basil, let's try like a sweet Thai basil and something else, and nothing did well. And we're actually convinced like these are the conditions basil needs. So, there's some assumption we're making that is very incorrect because we just couldn't do it. And I think what would happen is we'd get a crop and we'd see this basil. It was like, oh, it was beautiful, like 5 trays, looked like a nice lush carpet. You'd walk by and brush it, and the scent of basil would waft up into the air, and you would involuntarily smile because it was such a beautiful smell. And you're like, okay, we've got it. We finally got it. And then the next week, the crop's just wiped out by disease. And so it just, that sort of, that manic sort of crop success just was too much. And we just literally were like, even though we had, some demand for it, and we had restaurants that had it on their menu, we're like, we just can't grow it. It's just not worth the time and energy. It takes up too much space and is actually crowding things out. And yeah, like it's not an easy thing to be harvesting a diseased crop. You just intuitively like, okay, well, we'll just harvest this part of the tray, but there's something not right with this crop. So because we could never quite find it and could never really, we never really attuned to the basil. We just dropped it. And it was just like this is like one day, like there's just like we're done, and we've never talked about it since. It's just gone.
Thinking of everything that we talked about this episode, say somebody's at the very beginning and they haven't grown any microgreens before and they're just thinking about starting out, and they have some ideas of what their market might want in terms of demand. How many crops would you suggest a brand new grower starts with?
Well, if you recall, I did start in my first year with one single crop. I did sunflower shoots, and that is it. And had a relatively good year. I would sell $400 or $500 of sunflower shoots at a farmer's market, which I don't even think we could do now because it was very new, and lots of people have done it since. I would say your minimum's probably about 4 or 5. It really depends on 2 things. It depends on your scale, and it also depends on what else you're doing. So if you already have a farming operation and you want to introduce microgreens to it, you can do that 1 crop at a time. But if you want to start a microgreens business, like in the beginning, I was just like, I want to start a sunflower shoots business. And I hadn't really thought beyond like, oh yeah, like I would end up growing other stuff. So you've got to think if you're going to be a microgreens business, you generally, with any business, you have to have a bit of variety there. And once again, that's gonna help buffer you against the changing attitudes of your customers. We do have a lot of regular customers that are just like, yeah, like I just don't want to eat this anymore. I eat it too much. I want something new. And if you can provide them something new that still satisfies them, they will just shift how they spend their money with you. But if they want to move on to something new and you can't provide it, they'll shift and spend their money elsewhere. And especially if your market is a farmer's market where you've got a lot of competition for produce around you.
There you have it. When, how, and why to start producing a new microgreen crop. If you want to learn more about Chris's microgreen system and how he grows microgreens, you can do so in his Growing Your Microgreens Business course. It's an online course that covers all aspects of commercial microgreen production, going from fundamentals to specifics, with sections on infrastructure, equipment, soil, seeds, hygiene, sanitation, production, and a whole lot more. He covers each topic in detail, including all the tips, methodologies, and experiences that he's had growing microgreens for the last 9 years. As you heard in this episode, there's a lot of things to think about when growing crops. If you want to go more in depth with Chris and learn more, check out his online course using the link in the show description for this episode. Who's that course for? It's for somebody who's looking to start their microgreen business off on the right foot or take an existing operation to the next level. Learn more about that online course using the link below. That's all for this one today. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for future episodes all about microgreens with grower Chris Thoreau.